Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and I had to do some more playing with the Distress Oxides and Glossy Cardstock and Distress Glaze that I showed in a previous video, and I discussed the whole technique in that video. I will link to that one at the end of this one if you've missed it. But basically what you do is the same sort of ink smushing that we've shown with Distress inks for years now. The difference being is this time I'm using the Oxide inks and I'm using glossy cardstock. So I have Ranger glossy cardstock here. You can use glossy photo paper. I don't know exactly how it would turn out. It's a little bit thinner, but it would probably work. There's also alcohol ink cardstock that will work because it's very similar, if not the same. It's glossy. Not Yupo paper, totally different product. You just want a glossy surface cardstock. So I have a piece that I cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm doing the standard ink smushing, but I'm using Distress Oxide inks, not the Distress inks, not other dye inks. This whole technique works best with the Oxide inks. And you just smush your ink pad, spray a bit of water, and then just start smushing the glossy side of the cardstock into the color. And you want to layer this, like, I, did my little smushing and my splatters. I let it dry completely, which I speed up with my heat tool. And now I'm adding more layers with more splotches and splatters of ink. I also pick up some of the ink with just a microfiber cloth because sometimes I get big blobs. It depends on the look you're going for. I didn't want great big huge blobs, plus it takes longer to dry, which again, I speed up with my heat tool because otherwise it just takes too long. With this one, I did a bunch of blues, but I wanted to add browns along the bottom. I was heavily inspired by a set of cards that Turi, I can't pronounce her name to save my life. I will link to her blog post in my own blog post, but she did alcohol inks with hers, but she created this really cool ocean sand sort of a look with alcohol inks, and I loved how it looked. And I really wanted to try and recreate it with the oxides just for something fun. I still love my alcohol inks, but I'm currently obsessed with the oxides. So I did the blues mostly along the top, and then I'm smushing different shades of brown along the bottom area. This ends up looking like a hot mess. The whole idea with the oxides and the glossy cardstock is you do all these layers, you dry it between each layer, and when it's all dry, it looks very dull. It's very chalky looking. It's very dull. It's very weird. It's hard. It just doesn't look like anything. But it's when you add the Distress Glaze that it just brings out the color and the layers and the texture, and it's amazing. So I just kept adding layers, making sure to completely dry between each layer. You want to make sure the oxides are dry. You don't want any wet ink. That's where you get all the layering. And then you also want to make sure it's dry before you add the Distress Glaze. So I've got my little jar of Distress Glaze here. I have my sponge. I was asked in the last video about this because I used this same sponge in my last one. And you can see it's turned blue because it's picked up a lot of the ink and the color. It still works okay, but I actually do end up switching to a new sponge on my next panel. And then what I've discovered too is that I can just wash the sponge, and then I'm just going to switch between the two sponges to make sure one is dry. But anyway, I apply the Distress Glaze, and this is where you can see that just gorgeous, all the layers and the color and the splotches just come right through. And then I take my microfiber cloth and I just kind of burnish it really into the cardstock to make sure there's no excess glaze, to really smooth everything out. And it just looks amazing. So I'd done that one piece and I was happy with it. And then for my second piece, I'm doing the exact same thing, but this time, instead of smushing several of the colors at the same time, because you could see I was kind of using the corners of the ink pads and I was doing like 3 and 4 colors at once. This time I was like, I wonder what it would look like if I did one color at a time and did all those layers, all the same colors, but just one at a time. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just smushing my Distress Oxide ink onto my craft mat here, and I'm using my glass Tim Holtz mat, the craft mat. You don't need the glass mat for this. A craft mat or non-porous surface will work. Just something to smush the ink pads onto and then press the cardstock on. So this time, like I said, I'm doing just individual layers of one color at a time. So I just smush my Distress Oxide ink onto my craft surface, spray it lightly with water, and then I just start pressing the glossy side of this cardstock into it. And you get this like just fun splatter, amazing look. And then I will, you know, pick up some of the excess with a tissue sometimes or my microfiber cloth. And then I completely dry that layer with my heat tool. And you can see it's starting to look kind of like a chalky mess, but that's the beauty of this whole technique. So I keep wiping down my craft mat in between these layers of color so that I'm not mixing up the colors, because I want all these different layers of specific colors, and just keep repeating this process over and over again. So, and I was purposely leaving the bottom area white or, you know, less color, because I want to add those browns to create a more, like, it could either be, you know, the sand and the, you know, the beach, or, you know, underwater and this, like, the ocean floor, either one, whatever floats your boat. So with this one, I let it sit, and then I actually sprayed it with my distress sprayer, so I've got splatters of water all over it. Let that sit for a minute or so while I wiped off my work surface, and then I kind of picked up that water with the tissue again, and again, it creates that fun, you know, distress splatter look. Like, the sky's the limit with this technique, and it's going to look different every single time. It doesn't matter if you use the same colors, you know. That's the beauty too of just ink smushing, is it always looks different every single time, and it's just fun. I had ink everywhere. I had it all over me. This whole process, this video and these cards took me, I don't know, several days altogether between just everything, because I was having fun and making a mess, and my hands were stained for like 3 days. So I did the exact same thing though with this one. I'm adding layers of browns, like I was using antique linen, gathered twigs, and vintage photo for my like neutral brown shades for the ocean floor, the sand. And then all the blues I'll have listed. I'd use like Blueprint Sketch, Peacock Feathers, Broken China, and Salty Ocean, of course. And adding the browns, and it does look like, it just looks like a mess, especially when the color is completely dry. It just looks so blah and boring. But again, this is where the beauty comes in. And yes, like I'd said, like it needs to be a glossy surface, like the Ranger glossy cardstock or photo paper or something. Normal cardstock with these oxides will not work. The distressed watercolor paper will not work. It needs that gloss surface. That's where the glaze and the inks and everything just do their magic. You just won't get the same result. But if you have just glossy photo paper, I recommend trying it out. I've heard people had good results with that. I always have had packs of the Ranger glossy cardstock on hand, even though I never use it for anything. But now that I use it for this, it's like, ooh, this is fun. I'm probably going to use up all of the cardstock I have and get more. So now you can see the one on the left has no distress glaze on it. The one on the right was the first one I did with the glaze. You can see that difference. So this time, my sponge is filthy, and it's working. Like, it works just fine. But I found it was just like smearing the color around. There was so much like ink and just gunk like on that sponge. So I pulled it off, grabbed a fresh sponge, and I got better results. So with this, I'm going to have, like I said, I'm going to have those 2 sponges, and I'm just going to wash them when I'm done with them and just let them sit and dry. I mentioned in my Distress Oxide sponges video, I don't wash my sponges for the actual inks. Those I don't like washing. I don't recommend it. It's just not what I do. But specifically for this Oxide glaze, I will and do wash my sponges. I find it just gets all the gunk out of it, all that glaze, all the extra ink and whatnot, and just works better. And then I just squeeze out the extra water, let it sit and air dry, and it's good to go. So this one, again, like the layers and the color and everything, it just came to life when you add that glaze. And then I, burnished it again with my microfiber cloth to wipe off any of the excess. And it's just amazing how these end up looking completely different. All the exact same colors, they look completely different. So fun. So I did those 2 in that technique, and then I wanted to, and you can see, I don't know what exactly I was thinking when I showed those, but one of them was washed and one of them was new. But yeah, I'm just, like I said, going to keep my 2 sponges, and I'll just kind of alternate, and then when it gets too gunked up with the glaze and the ink, I'll wash it and it's good to go. So for this one, I used the same colors, except for this time I'm adding in, I'm going to end up adding in a little bit of Wilted Violet. But I smushed the ink pads, but this time instead of bringing the cardstock to the ink and doing the smushing, I sprayed the inks with water, and then I'm just picking them up with a brush and painting it just across the cardstock. Really simple, no technique needed. I just wanted to completely cover this panel with the Oxide inks. And again, thinking in my head, this would be, you know, the look of like ocean waves. So working kind of from lighter to darker, and then in the bottom, I add in that wilted violet. And I purposely went from like edge to edge because with all these pieces, I was planning on cutting them in half. So I wanted to make sure that I got all the way to the edge so I could utilize like, you know, every square inch of this cardstock. And same thing, I painted all that on, dried it with my heat tool, and then I'm gonna add in more layers of color. So just kind of mixing them together, letting them sort of do their own thing color-wise, making a grand old mess, and it's just fun. So keep going back and forth with that brush and kind of letting the colors really like blend into each other and moving them around and just seeing what kind of combos too I'm getting by mixing these colors together. I'm starting to sound like such a broken record with these Oxide inks, but I really, really do love them. They're so much fun. People keep asking, do I recommend these over Distress inks? No, both. I can't, they're so different. I'll do a video maybe explaining the differences. I don't know. It's kind of been done. Tim Holtz has done so many videos and like explained it, but anyway, I can go on a tangent. I did, like I said, the same thing. Ended up doing about 3 layers, I think, of ink on this panel. And I still had a ton of ink left over on my work surface. I had another piece because I just took a full 8.5 by 11 sheet and had cut it into 4 pieces. So this 4th piece, I just grabbed it and I did the same thing. But this one is going to be different because there's so much water already added to these inks. So they're already very watered down. And it just gives it a completely different look. Again, same colors, but this one is very watered down. But I did multiple layers. I think I did like 3 layers at least again of these inks. And then everything is dry. So I took the nozzle out of my Distress sprayer this time and just, you know, flicked it and tapped it against my fingers to cover both of these pieces with water drops. Let it sit for about a minute, picked up that excess again with my tissue, and then heat set them again with my heat tool so that everything is completely dry. All completely dry. You don't want wet ink because otherwise the sponge of the Distress Glaze is just gonna move the ink around. So now I can pick up the Distress Glaze with my sponge and sponge that over the surface and then burnish it in again with my microfiber cloth. And you don't need very much of the Distress Glaze. It's like very little. Like this container is going to last, if you're just using it for this sort of a technique, it's going to last like forever. You really don't need much at all. A tiny little bit goes a long way. So burnish that in really, really well with the microfiber cloth. And again, it just brings out the layers and the color and the intensity of it all and removes that bit of a chalky residue you get. It's just fun. So I did this with the second piece, which again ended up looking completely different. So I had so much fun making these, and you can check out my other video where I did kind of the similar idea with the colors because I did like water themed, backgrounds, but you can just, like I said, just keep experimenting and you can like layer all sorts of colors, and it's amazing how the colors just pop once you add that Distress Glaze. So with all those backgrounds, I of course wanted to make some ocean themed cards. So I had pulled out the Simon Says Stamp Under the Sea Animals stamp set, and I pulled out all the images from it, and I'm going to stamp them onto Nina Solar White Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock. And I'm stamping that with Simon's Intense Block ink. So it's Copic friendly cardstock with Copic friendly ink. And I end up stamping all these images at least twice because this piece is big enough. I just flip it around in my little stamp platform, stamp all the images again, and then I filled in the areas that there was space for with more images. And then I colored all of these in with Copic markers. I don't have video footage of that. I'm sorry. One that would make this video twice as long as it already is. But I just sat and colored without my camera on. I think, again, I had probably Friends on Netflix or something. And just kind of zoned out and colored. I will have all the colors I used. I have a picture of them. I'll have that on my blog post. So I will have specifically all the colors I used. So I colored them all, die cut them with the coordinating dies, and I'd also use my white gel pen to add all my little dots and highlights to those. And then for the sentiments, I'm using I think all or most of the sentiments in that same Under the Sea Animal set. And I just have some black cardstock in my stamp platform, and then my clear misty grid that I used so I could line up all of those sentiments at once. And then I used my anti-static powder tool on the cardstock and I stamped all of those sentiments with Simon's clear embossing ink. And then I'm going to white heat emboss those with white embossing powder. So sprinkle that over all those sentiments, melted all that with my heat tool. So I've got all 6 sentiments stamped and heat embossed in one pass. Just saves me the time and effort since I was planning on making multiple cards. So once I have all those melted with my heat tool, I can pull out my Fiskars trimmer. When I'm doing cuts where I really need to measure, I really do prefer my Fiskars trimmer because it has the wire guide in the middle, and I've never had a problem with this one. Other than, well, my wire snapped like a couple years ago, but Fiskars replaced that, no problem. They sent me a whole new like arm with the wire and everything. So I used that so I could visually see exactly where the cut was going to be, and I was able to quickly trim down all of these pieces, you know, one after another, into nice, perfectly narrow sentiments, and then trim off the excess for all of these. So I have all my sentiments on the black cardstock, just nice and trimmed and simple. So I've done all that, and then I have my cardstock bases, which are just going to be white cardstock. They'll be A2 size cards, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And like I said, I wanted to cut my panels here in half. So I'm just going to line these up and cut them at 2 3/4, which is half of this 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 piece. So I'm going to cut 3 of them in half. The 4th one I'll just save for a future like card or two. So I cut 3 of them in half so that I have 6 little glazed oxide backgrounds here. And then I had a ton of images. And it just so happened that I ended up with, I think 18 images, something like that. So every single card got 2 on the front and 1 on the inside. So I have my card bases, and then I also just cut down different colors of cardstock into strips as well, just to add a little something to these cards. I decided to keep the cards very simple since I'd put in all the time into doing those backgrounds and then a ton of time coloring all of those images, etc. So the actual cards I kept fairly simple. So I just adhered those, the color cardstock panels flat to the card base with my Xyron Mega Runner. And then I'd put foam tape on the back of all of these Glaze Oxide panels and just kind of adhere that sort of offset on each of these. And then to adhere all my little sea creatures, I just used Simon's Craft Tacky Glue. And I had kind of figured out which images I wanted to go together and, you know, what sentiments to go with, etc. So, and then I would combine whatever image I'd used on the outside, that's what I was going to adhere on the inside. So I adhered all my little critters with that Craft Tacky Glue, and then to finish off the inside of all the cards, I just adhere one of the little coordinating colored images. And then as a final bit of embellishment, because I want the focus to be on these fun oxide backgrounds, but you gotta add a little bling. You know, I need to get my fix somehow. So I pulled out some Lucy's Rainbow Jewels. I have the Rainbow Sparkle Mix, and I also have the Chunky Rainbow Sparkle Mix. And I would choose colors that would go with the creatures I had adhered. So this one, I'm using like the purples, the blues, and the greens. The ones with like the crabs, I would add some red sparkles or red jewels too. Like I was kind of coordinating them with the little creatures to keep everything sort of, you know, cohesive. And I just adhered those in place with the Craft Tacky Glue, just picking them up with my jewel picker and then adhering them into place. And that finished off all of these cards. So that was my whole card set for the day and my extremely long video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. They were really fun to make, and they turned out so cute. Their little ocean backgrounds and their little jewels and everything. So as always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I'll have links to all the supplies used. There'll be a supply list below the video with direct links to everything if you are interested. I will also link at the end of this one my previous video doing this same technique, so you can check that out if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!